my vision of the future is that the grid would be comprised of microgrids and VPPs tying them together. So if we had to start the grid all over, like people say, if we start all over, they would be DC, like Thomas Edison started with DC microgrids. I don't see us going DC, direct current, but I see more DC, I see more diversity. So I think, we have a little bit of a rough stretch, but I've also heard people say the lack of subsidies or some of the grant funds that have been taken away could be good for the industry, just to not be so focused on chasing subsidies, but more just making those economic arguments you mentioned, and they can be made. And, this is a global market. So with the
Are you speeding the energy transition? Here at the Clean Power Hour, our host Tim Montague bring you the best in solar, batteries, and clean technologies every week. Want to go deeper into decarbonization? We do too. We're here to help you understand and command the commercial, residential, and utility solar, wind, and storage industries. So let's get to it. Together we can speed the energy transition.
The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more. Hey guys, are you a residential solar installer doing light commercial but wanting to scale into large C&I solar? I'm Tim Montague. I've developed over 150 megawatts of commercial solar, and I've solved the problem that you're having. You don't know what tools and technologies you need in order to successfully close 100 kW to megawatt scale projects. I've developed a commercial solar accelerator to help installers exactly like you. Just go to cleanpowerhour.com, click on strategy, and book a call today. It's totally free with no obligation. Thanks for being a listener. I really appreciate you listening to the pod. And I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Go to Clean Power Hour and click strategy today. Thanks so much. Today on the Clean Power Hour, we continue the journey into microgrids. My guest today is Peter Asmus. He is an expert in microgrids. He's the author of the upcoming book, Alaska Microgrid Innovators, and the author of 4 other books on energy. So welcome to the show, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
It's really great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to bringing this content to my guests on the show. And so my listeners know, I'm doing a series on batteries and microgrids for a book I'm writing called Wired for Resilience, the Battery and Microgrid Playbook. So if you know a microgrid or battery expert that I should talk to, please send them my way. You can connect with me at cleanpowerhour.com or on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find. So Peter, give us a little background on yourself. How did you get interested in the energy industry? And then let's fast forward to the last couple of years, what you've been up to in this space.
Sure. Well, I am not an engineer. Was trained as a journalist and moved from topic to topic. Actually, when I first moved to California way back in like 1981, I was actually a political reporter in Sacramento, and then kind of became an environmental reporter, and then just randomly started working for some electricity trade journals. And then from there, I wrote a couple books. You mentioned a few. The first one, the first one was a Simon & Schuster book. The second one, which was more generally environmental. The second one focused on SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which closed a nuclear reactor by citizen vote, ballot initiative, first time that ever happened, and then replaced it with what we now call distributed energy resources. Then wrote a book about wind power, then wrote a book about the history of energy in California, kind of a broad swap of just what all California's done. And then I started working for Navigant Guidehouse, leading up their microgrid research. And with that, I had a global perspective on microgrids. I had to forecast the future, which we always, as an analyst, I shouldn't say hated, but it's kind of like, how can you predict the future? But someone wants somebody to do that. And then now, most recently, I was working in Alaska, and hence that book.
So, yeah, let's talk about your Alaska experience. You commented that everyone in Alaska is on a microgrid. And I think my listeners understand that there are different scales. We call, individual home microgrids a nanogrid, or a small, commercial facility would be a nanogrid. And then you have campuses, and then you have communities that can be a microgrid. It could be a village, it could be a small city, it could be a neighborhood in a bigger city. But tell us about your experience in Alaska, and why is everyone living on a microgrid in Alaska?
Well, Alaska's microgrid market is very different than the rest of the US. So first of all, there are 100 utilities in Alaska serving, let's say, less than 750,000 people. So in the lower 48, one utility like a Duke Energy would be serving way more than that amount of customers. So the market in Alaska is very decentralized, and all those microgrids in Alaska are run by utilities, which is very different than the lower 48, where when I first started covering microgrids in 2009, most utilities were pretty hostile. And although that's changed, there are now utilities in the lower 48 deploying microgrids. In Alaska, those microgrids I'm referring to are all, for the most part, community utility run microgrids, mostly by cooperatives, which is also another kind of unique feature. So in Alaska, you have remote communities. Most of Alaska is not connected to any grid. So these are what I used to call remote microgrids. And then you have the rail belt grid, which is the only transmission system. And those are microgrids that just touch each other. So it's like a series of stacked microgrids on top of each other. So it's true. Every single person in Alaska does get their electricity from a microgrid.
Yeah. And, I'm guessing that the majority of those microgrids are fossil fuel powered. Is that not accurate?
That is not true. The irony, and again, this is counterintuitive, is that the microgrids connected to the rail belt grid are pretty heavily dependent on natural gas as a fuel. The remote system started out as pure diesel systems for the most part. Some started out 100% renewable, like Cordova is one example, started out 100% hydro, then went to 100% diesel, and now is a hybrid hydro, battery, diesel, 75% of its power coming from renewable energy. The most extreme example of 100% renewable energy is Kodiak Island, second largest island in the US, 28 megawatt peak load. It is basically 99.5% renewable with a combination of wind, hydro, flywheels, and lithium ion batteries.
Oh, cool. I guessed fossil fuels would measure large just because Alaska is rich in fossil fuels, and so they have ready access to fossil fuels. But of course, you have ready access to lots of wind, not so much solar, but yeah. Tell us a little more about the penetration of wind, solar, and batteries in the Alaska market.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned solar, because it's true that people used to just assume, well, how would you do solar in Alaska? You're at the top of the world. Everyone hears about parts of the year where there's no sun, which is true. But that also means there's parts of the year where the sun never sets.
Right.
So solar has actually kind of really come alive over the last few years because batteries have become more affordable. And you know all about that. And that's why when I started writing about microgrids 2009, it was lead acid batteries was the default, and there were many microgrids that didn't have any batteries at all. So Alaska has even a geothermal microgrid. I think it's the only one in the world So in Alaska, because of these remote areas, the most diverse renewables are actually in microgrids that tend to be remote, globally, because that's where you might have wind. It's hard to do wind in most urban areas, generally speaking. So you have a little bit of everything in Alaska, but the renewables, there's no renewable portfolio standards. So these microgrids in Alaska go renewable to save money because diesel is so expensive in remote areas. It might show up only twice a year on a barge or by airplane. A lot of these communities don't even have roads interconnecting to them. So the renewables are deployed not necessarily for environmental reasons, but often economic and just sort of resiliency, diversity. You don't want to put all your eggs in the diesel basket, so to speak.
Yeah, and money talks, when it comes to the built environment, whatever is most economical is usually what happens. And and then there's this thing, this value stack, earn, save, protect. You can earn money with grid services. You can save money by attacking demand and capacity charges with like batteries. And you can protect yourself from grid outages. Now, in the Alaska market, as you're pointing out, there is no real grid, so it's more operating on a microgrid is the norm, and you may have outages because the generator goes down or what have you. But back to my question, though, about the penetration of wind, batteries, and solar, if you had to guess about the mix when it comes to how consumers and business owners are consuming electricity, what are the relative, sizes of those couple of buckets?
I did a white paper in 2018 that looked at that, and I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but it's actually, if most people are on the rail belt grid, which is the part of the system most dependent on natural gas. Now, there are now seeking decarbonization scenarios. And in fact, my book talks about the research, how can they do more renewables? Unfortunately, for the fourth year in a row, an RPS, a renewable portfolio standard, failed. So, I would say it's more maybe like 25% of electricity in all of Alaska comes probably from renewables, and some of that is from some large hydro, which is also unusual for microgrids. The one in Cordova is 2 run-of-the-river hydro, which is also fairly unusual for microgrids. So, and they have done a lot, diesel, I like to beat up on diesel, but in Alaska, they have done a lot of innovation with diesel generators. First of all, dealing with cold weather, even batteries. A lot of batteries fail in Alaska because it's so cold. So a lot of the Alaska story is things that work in other places don't work there. The other thing I like to say is Alaska looks more like the rest of the world and the rest of the US. If you look globally, most microgrids are remote systems in places like Africa, the Asia, Australia is another one. Australia and Hawaii tend to collaborate a lot with Alaska because even though their environments are different, Hawaii is a series of islands. Western Australia, it's got the largest utility service territory in the world, the fewest amount of people, and that's also served primarily by sort of what we might call remote microgrids.
Cool. So let's step back to the national landscape, and we can continue to maybe give some examples from the Alaska market. But you've obviously been following the evolution of microgrids, and the as you mentioned, historically, utilities were not necessarily fond of microgrids because maybe they're thinking of customers defecting from the grid. But as it turns out, right, when it comes to their mandate to provide resiliency, for example, right, their mandate is to provide 99.999% uptime with their resources to consumers, right? And they do a very good job. We have in the in the greater scheme of things, we have an amazingly stable, resilient grid in the United States. We don't often have outages, but we do have outages. I was just looking yesterday, and in 2024, there were at least half a dozen outages across the U.S. that impacted hundreds of thousands of people. Some of them were caused by storms. Well, the majority of them were caused by storms, either hurricanes or other storms. Some were caused by fires also. But this, when you, so there's how the utilities are viewing things. There's what's going on in the environment. And let's just get on the table that, okay, the weather's changing. Big storm events are more frequent now. There's no debating that. That's just a fact of life. Grid demand is going up. This is partially because of the AI revolution and the explosion of AI data centers, but also because of electrification and just economic growth. And then, there is, depending on the year, a mandate to decarbonize the grid. And this is now very varied from geography to geography how important that mandate is, and it's not a priority for our current administration, but that just is a 4-year long ride, right? And it goes up and down as different administrations come and go. But consumers generally want a cleaner environment. I read today that 90,000 people in America die every year from air pollution related causes, mostly from fossil fuels, right? So we do acknowledge in the public health sector that fossil fuels are not good for human health. They have consequences. And then of course, they are also putting carbon in the atmosphere, which is causing climate change, which is a long-term consequence for humanity. It's not so much a factor for individual lifetimes, but more generations. And I have often said on the show, I want to create a safer, healthier future for humanity, for future generations, and cleaning the grid is just one small piece of that. But Peter, from where you sit, how has the landscape nationally been changing, good, bad, or ugly?
Well, I would say when I started looking at microgrids, as I said, and most utilities were opposed. I mean, the first large-scale utility microgrid actually was put in near where you said I don't know if you currently live near San Diego, where San Diego Gas and Electric did the Borrego Springs project, where that was an R&D project, but it was also a kind of a utility rate case where the community was so kind of up in the high desert, I understand, and the cost of building or reinforcing a transmission line was so high that it actually made more economic sense to just create a microgrid, and that microgrid grew over time. It incorporated a solar farm. But I would say when I first started, it was lead acid batteries. Most people assumed a microgrid would still include a diesel generator. As you know, the diesel generator has always been viewed as sort of backup power, and there's still a debate. Is backup power really a microgrid? There are many people saying no. What I would say is that diesel generators generally are still in a lot of microgrids because they're already there. So the other thing about microgrids is almost all microgrids are not greenfield projects. Now that's starting to change, but historically, there was usually something there. Now it could even be solar's already there, and you want to add a battery, and then maybe you want to add some other resources. So that's one change. The commercial and industrial segment, when I first started doing my market forecast, I divided it by geography and then by sort of market segments. The C&I segment, so to speak, is sort of the smallest segment because, first of all, they're most concerned with cost. And back then, solar was maybe still viewed as cost more, batteries maybe cost more than diesel generators, etc. But what's changed is the cost of all those DERs until recently kept going down and down and down. Now I just did a blog recently that shows that PPA prices have started increasing since COVID, actually. The tariff uncertainty and all this stuff, so we're in a sort of now with the Trump canceling all these, President Trump canceling all these contracts, we're kind of in an odd space. But I'd say now the C&I segment is actually the fastest growing segment. And the reason why is, you kind of hinted at that, is with power outages, right now, the main value a microgrid provides is resiliency, but the regulatory system doesn't put a monetary value on resiliency. That's difficult to do. That could take years if you get a bunch of academics trying to figure out, well, how much is that worth? But businesses know how much they lost during a power outage. And that's what's made sort of the C&I segment one of the fastest growing. The other one that's growing more are utility deployed microgrids. I think one reason for the shift in utility viewpoints, and these examples are from California, is there were a couple times there was a wildfire in San Diego again, where the UC San Diego microgrid saved the whole grid from collapsing just by islanding. And what I heard was just 4 megawatts. We were 4 megawatts away from the San Diego gas and electric grid going down. There was a similar example with a Miramar microgrid, which I'm not sure if that's in Edison or San Diego gas and electric service territory, but it was a similar thing where the utility asked the microgrid to go into island mode, taking that load off the system, thereby stretching the remaining resources. So I think that's what's changed, is microgrids provide value during emergencies, but the other thing that's changed is the regulations on grid services, and you mentioned that, have evolved. So a microgrid, when you think about it, it's the best demand response resource you could have. You know, when it islands, all of that load is off the system, versus, consumers who might, in the middle of, at the end of summer, tired of participating in programs, and the sort of participation rates generally decline over time, over the calendar year. So those are some of the changes, I'd say. I guess one other change is, some people still believe you need a fossil fuel generator in a microgrid. You need a prime mover, but now the inverter technology is involved to sort of evolve to create what some people call virtual inertia. There are ways to have microgrids that don't require fossil fuel. And then, I guess here my list keeps going on. The other trend I see is fuel flexible generators. So you might have a generator that can burn natural gas, but over time could shift to biogas and hydrogen. All those things kind of showing that microgrids can continue to evolve as new technology.
The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more. Well, I'm very interested in the C&I and community scale microgrid, and in general distributed energy resources. I'm a big fan of Craig Lewis's at the Clean Coalition, that has made a mark developing some community scale microgrids in California and in Michigan. So, it seems to me like we now have the technology, right? The lithium iron phosphate, the cost of lithium iron phosphate is now low enough that we're deploying lithium iron phosphate at scale. We have very sophisticated electronics, whether that's the power control systems for battery inverters or the virtual power plant controller, right? So you can have a bunch of smaller batteries. I had a conversation with AJ Perkins about his work both in Southern California and in Hawaii, where they're installing fairly large residential batteries in whole communities, though, where every home, say 3,000 homes, are getting a 40 kilowatt hour battery, and, the agglomerate battery, the VPP, is like 20 megawatts. And that becomes a real node resource for the utility to, help balance its load elsewhere. So what are your thoughts about community microgrids, and do you have any good examples for us?
Well, I would say you mentioned my other topic. I'm also an expert on VPPs. In fact, I guess, quoted in Wikipedia, but that was a definition I came up with 2011. I did my first VPP report when no one really knew what a VPP was. And I think that's why we did a report. When you're in the report business, it's great to be the first one to kind of try to define something. And by trying to size the VPP market, microgrids was hard enough. And it still is hard because there's no public reporting requirement for a lot of microgrids. And VPPs, it's more of a definitional issue. And before I answer your question, I actually have my own, I guess I would call it a nanogrid. I have a solar battery system, but I'm also part of a VPP. And continuing on my last thing, the other thing that's changed in the microgrid market is the merging of microgrids and VPPs. When I was an analyst, I always tried to separate those because we were forecasting for separate reports. But I think the lines between microgrids, VPPs, and DERMS, yet another concept, distributed energy resource management systems, are blurring. And, that's just partially, as you mentioned, there's more batteries being deployed in sort of communities. Now, the thing about a community microgrid is, though, it's very difficult to develop a community microgrid unless the utility is involved. If the utility is not involved, it's difficult. Although you mentioned Michigan, there is a project with my friend Steve Pullins is doing in Michigan. That's I believe a community. I think it's an apartment building, but it's off grid. That's the only way they could do it without the utility. Is it had to be, even though it's in a area that has grid access, had to go off grid. So when you talk to the general citizen out there, and that's how I got into it. Someone said, well, why can't we just build our own power system? And this is again back in 2008, when you start looking into the rules where, you can't send power in most states over a public right of way. You can't send power to your neighbor because of legacy monopoly regulations. And so those things are being chipped away over time, but in large part, a lot of that still exists. So, there's a lot of interest in community microgrids. I did for a while of work, and I forgot, they used to be called Amera. I think then they became Block Energy, which was sort of the idea of a utility deployed DC microgrid, which would have individual assets at the homes, but you mentioned like a shared community battery. And I remember I did a white paper for them years ago. So there's a lot of innovation with community microgrids, whether most of them still AC. I know there was one project abandoned in Berkeley that was going to be a DC microgrid. And again, it was the utility monopoly regulations that caused them to change way. But it's this merging of VPPs and microgrids that I think is helping the concept of a community microgrid, or at least a community distributed energy resource based system.
Yeah, I think the project I'm referring to is Ann Arbor's SEU.
Yes, I think that's the Steve Pullins project.
Sustainable Energy Utility. And it's an opt-in supplemental community-owned energy utility that provides 100% renewable energy from local solar and battery storage systems installed at participating homes and businesses. Now authorized, the detailed final planning and design work to officially launch the SEU can begin in earnest, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that was, I think it's like really unfolding now in 2025, but...
Yeah, I might be mixing that up because the project I'm thinking of, I thought was in Ann Arbor too. So I'm not sure if it's the exact same project, but
well, yeah, I'm sure there's many projects in Ann Arbor. It is kind of at the fore of the clean energy transition as far as Midwestern communities go.
Well, I wanted to follow up. You mentioned the Clean Coalition. So there's actually two proposed microgrids near where I live, one of which the Clean Coalition is involved with. I think the other one, they're part of a new utility community microgrid program. Now, I've heard good things about the program. Then I've heard developers say, well, actually, the programs are very bureaucratic, and it takes like 4 years for those projects to come through, and that the utility actually only provides the switch to go off grid or stay connected and controls that. And so, people who think they want their own community microgrid will probably be disappointed with some of those systems. But what Clean Coalition is focusing on is what we call front of the meter microgrids. We haven't made that distinction. Most microgrids are behind the meter historically because they're not utility projects. And so front of the meter is kind of a different animal. And that's the other area where more attention has been paid to, because only a utility can do that. And that's where you kind of have different issues. And then you also start kind of overlapping with VPPs. Like most VPPs also use behind the meter assets, but now VPPs are also using front of the meter assets. So again, all these sort of distinctions and lines are being blurred here as the whole market evolves.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I love about the Clean Coalition's approach is to get utilities on board by saying to them, look, we want you to install infrastructure, which is what they want to do because they have a cost plus model. Traditionally, that's T&D, transmission and distribution, but you can install solar, wind, and batteries and microgrid hardware at the community scale and own and operate those assets, right? So you're getting to build infrastructure, but then giving the community the possibility of microgridding from the greater grid in the event of a wide area outage.
Yes. No, it's a great way to get utilities on board with the microgrid concept, and perhaps eventually use different kinds of models. I mean, I think that's the beauty of a microgrid, is it's such a diverse platform. I mean, you can have all different kinds of resources, all different kinds of sizes of these systems. And I used to call like my home a nanogrid. Some people would still call it a microgrid. That's yet another term out there. I mean, in some ways it doesn't matter what you call it. But no, there are utilities are innovating. They're also, the other thing, I guess, a couple of things are coming to mind. When I first started with microgrids, there was no state programs for microgrids at all. The first one I believe was in Connecticut, 2011, and that was in response to hurricanes. So it's true that the weather, it started with hurricanes, then there were wildfires on the West Coast, then we had unusual freezing things happening in Texas. And so all of these sort of things have stimulated programs. I just heard that both Colorado and Oregon have passed new programs, which people were saying were some of the best in the country. I'm actually thinking of trying to write a white paper looking at all the state programs out there and sort of culling and maybe coming up with an ideal, menu of policies. That's something I've talked to some people about doing. So, I think there's somewhat of a layer cake here, right? There's federal policy, there's state policy, and then there's individual utilities and their willingness to embrace or not the energy transition, which they usually are doing on a fiscal basis, right? When you look at the landscape of what large utilities, these are, I'm thinking of the owners of generation facilities of what historically was coal, natural gas, and nuclear fleets, right? They're transitioning their fleets to wind, solar, and batteries. And now there's, a bit of a resurgence. They're holding off on decommissioning, or they're recommissioning some things, including gas, maybe coal and nuclear plants, because of what's going on federally. But anyway, there are these levers, right, that society is pulling. And, for example, then there's things that happen in certain places, like Storm Uri. That was a wake-up call for ERCOT, for Texas, right? Hundreds of thousands of people were without power for several days, and it was very close
to being a much bigger catastrophe. It was within minutes of becoming a weeks-long outage, apparently. But now, for example, I think in Texas they've rolled out like $1.2 billion of funding for resilience, for critical infrastructure, community centers, first responders, hospitals, places that really are vital for the running of society when the grid goes down, right? And providing refuge for consumers. So when you think about this, these different levers, where are the shining stars in your opinion?
Well, one thing about microgrids is it's still it's state regulations that's more important than federal, because federal regulation, FERC, is more, generally speaking, the transmission system, whereas the distribution level systems, are more state regulated. And one thing you did mention, then there's the ISO RTOs, which, are another layer, and that's more with the grid services, the connection between the distribution system and the transmission system, which used to be operated separately, but all these DERs and now sort of organized through microgrids enables more shifting back and forth between the two. But in terms of shining stars, actually, I'd say one of the biggest, I'm disappointed in California regulation myself when it comes to microgrids. People always say, oh, you're in California, California is doing so many good things. We are. But when it comes to microgrids and DERs in general, actually, I don't think California is doing such a good job. But since you mentioned Texas, one of the companies, the innovators, and I just am finishing a white paper for that company coming out shortly, is Enchanted Rock, which does microgrids based on natural gas. They had a fleet in Texas, and now they're expanding. But those microgrids balance wholesale wind power. So it's an interesting business model they're now applying to data centers in the future, is this idea that these microgrids don't operate that much. They're natural gas, so they're cleaner than diesel generation. And in Texas, when the wind dies, you need something to respond quickly to fill in those gaps while the other resources can kind of fill it up. And that's what the Enchanted Rock business model is. Now, for data centers, they're arguing, data centers can't find power. The utilities move too slow. There's now new policies that are, one is in Texas, it's being implemented in California, and New York, I believe it's New York, I don't quote me on that, sort of flexible interconnects, temporary interconnects for resources that can kind of come online quickly while the utility kind of brings online other renewables. So the Enchanted Rock offer is you can deploy their systems quickly. They can actually, they're not in conflict with renewables. They're sort of spot deployments that help data centers who want to come on quickly have power. And while the renewables come online later, they don't displace renewables like big natural gas combined cycle plants would, which would then sit there for 20, 30 years and would basically take up the room that renewables could have filled. So that's, more of the private sector innovation. But Texas, California and Texas tend to battle each other. But, Texas surpassed California in renewable energy, sort of surprising to some folks, mainly because it's a little more deregulatory environment. I am an environmentalist, but, I also understand that you got to have workable sort of regulations, and that's, often a moving target.
Yeah, I didn't know about Enchanted Rock, so I appreciate that reference. And that URL is just enchantedrock.com, but they provide what they call resiliency as a service.
Yep.
So I assume that they're in the business of installing microgrids and then owning the asset.
Yes, they're more for commercial facilities in Texas. They serve a lot. Well, they started more like these huge gas stations in Texas. I think they're called Buc-ee's, and some other customers. And now they're doing a 100 megawatt data center in California, but how California is not very wild about natural gas. In fact, they're trying to eliminate it even from, residential homes and all that stuff. But they have offset all of the natural gas emissions with renewable natural gas offsets that they then inject into the grid. So in that sense, they're using sort of offsets to reach the California market. So that's a project that is under development right now.
Hey guys, are you a residential solar installer doing light commercial but wanting to scale into large C&I solar? I'm Tim Montague. I've developed over 150 megawatts of commercial solar, and I've solved the problem that you're having. You don't know what tools and technologies you need in order to successfully close 100 kW to megawatt scale projects. I've developed a commercial solar accelerator to help installers exactly like you. Just go to cleanpowerhour.com, click on strategy, and book a call today. It's totally free with no obligation. Thanks for being a listener. I really appreciate you listening to the pod. And I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Go to Clean Power Hour and click strategy today. Thanks so much. Cool. Well, what else should our listeners know when it comes to microgrids? It's a big topic. There are many flavors of microgrids, from the scale to the combination of resources involved, but I'm fascinated by this concept, honestly, of resiliency as a service. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but it makes a lot of sense. And I just think that today a minority of communities have community scale resiliency. Certainly wealthy individuals are installing generators, backup generators, and now backup batteries or solar and batteries, right? And that's great for those nano grids, but we want to provide this level of resiliency for tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people. And so I'm very keen to see this community scale microgrid grow in implementation. What do you think are the barriers that we need to overcome in the United States to see this happen on a wider scale?
Well, first of all, I mentioned, and regulations are generally at the state level and utility level moving in a direction that will allow for more microgrid growth. The data center, when I went to the last microgrid conference, the Microgrid Knowledge Conference, which is the biggest one, everyone was talking about data centers. So the microgrid industry, because utilities can't provide that power quick enough. And so data centers, which historically had armies of diesel generators just sat there, hardly ever used, if they had cleaner assets on site, they could use them also when the grid wasn't down, and they could provide grid services. Data centers historically never wanted to tinker with anything because they're so concerned about reliability. They didn't want to do demand response, didn't want to do that. I think that's changing. But in terms of communities, you mentioned resiliency as a service. There's also energy as a service, which is a buzzword. I used energy as a service. I paid nothing for my solar and battery system up front. I'm just paying for it through like a mortgage, and I got my utility bill for the year was less than $10 because the utility costs have gone up so much in California. I saw some statistic that utility costs in the US have gone up 30% over the last 3 years. Now, I mentioned PPA prices are also going up, and that's probably one reason. So, I think one, for community microgrids, let's let lots of different models experiment. I don't think there'll ever be like just one model or like one company is the other one. A lot of people think, oh, well, the GEs of the world, the Siemens of the world, the Hitachis, Schneider Electrics, one of them will come in and just have the best thing and sliced bread and everyone will migrate to that. I don't see that happening, but, it raises the issue that open standards and agnostic, in the when I first started covering microgrids, most large vendors wanted to lock you in like an Apple iPhone, all you can do. And so now I think people are realizing the market is better served by you bring your own device, which is, BYOD for like demand response. And the microgrid controllers, this is the other thing we haven't touched, have improved so much that, the best microgrid controllers can interact with all different kinds of manufacturers. And that's what's happened also with BPP. So the use of AI, better controls is that's the most important technology change. The DER assets are commercial, their costs have come down. There's a temporary little, some opposition to that in the US. Globally, though, all this stuff is taking off. So community microgrids, I think you have to, for now, keep the utility involved, maybe always have the utility involved. Like in Alaska, they are utility cooperatives. And we just need to keep experimenting. But the good news is technology keeps getting better. And, there won't be a vendor lock-in issue, I think, with microgrids. You won't have like Apple versus whatever. You're just going to have more diversity. And that can work if you have controls that are more open standards, open source, etc.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree that the technology landscape is going to continue to evolve, but we've arrived at a moment when we have very good technology, both on the software and hardware side of things. And there's just no reason why we can't deploy microgrids at scale. Got to make a good economic case for them, obviously. And a lot of it depends on the value of resilience, honestly, because that is very amorphous.
Yep.
Now, Clean Coalition has developed a paradigm called, I think it's called VOR 123 or something like that, right. Which I'll be talking about at the Tennessee conference. But anyway, all right. Well, Peter, I don't have any other questions unless there's something else you want our listeners to know. I'm happy to wrap this up.
Yeah, I would just say, I think microgrids, my vision of the future is that the grid would be comprised of microgrids and VPPs tying them together. So if we had to start the grid all over, like people say, if we start all over, they would be DC, like Thomas Edison started with DC microgrids. I don't see us going to DC direct current, but I see more DC, I see more diversity. So I think, we have a little bit of a rough stretch, but I've also heard people say the lack of subsidies or some of the grant funds that have been taken away could be good for the industry just to not be so focused on chasing subsidies, but more just making those economic arguments you mentioned, and they can be made. And, this is a global market. So if the US has a few issues in the next coming years, the rest of the world will be moving forward, and climate change is a global problem. So microgrids are definitely a key part of the solution.
All right. Well, check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. Please tell a friend about the show. Give us a rating and review on Apple or Spotify. Follow us on YouTube and reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love hearing from my listeners. Peter, how can our listeners find you?
Well, I have my own website. It's just my name, peterasmus.com. You can find all kinds of blogs, articles, white papers, podcasts. I'll probably put this one on if I can, put this one on my website as well. So just Google Peter Asmus, ASMUS.com.
I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 10 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS product lineup includes string inverters ranging from 25 kW to 350 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 350 kW, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. CPS is the world's most bankable inverter brand and is America's #1 choice for solar plants, now offering solutions for commercial, utility, ESS, and balance of system requirements. Go to chintpowersystems.com or call 855-584-7168 to find out more.